director of the Vancouver Society in Support Democratic Movement. Welcome everybody here in a long weekend, Sunday afternoon. Thank you again for coming. And we're so pleased to have Professor Yun as well, Henry Yun from UBC to talk to us. And I'll just give you some brief idea who is Professor Yun. Professor Yun is currently the principal of St. John's Graduate College, UBC's International Graduate College, and served as its associate principal from 2005 to 2009. Professor Yu is also the director of the Initiative for Student Teaching and Research in Chinese-Canadian Studies, the first stage of a long-term commitment at UBC to the study of Trans-Pacific migration and a long history of interaction between Asian and European migrants and First Nation people in Pacific Canada. And Professor Yu has been involved in many projects or communities related to human rights and social justice. Here, I'll just highlight a few, because otherwise it will take a long time to introduce Henry. There's a few things that really highlight that I really appreciate. That Henry is a founding board member of the Chinese-Canadian Historical Society of British Columbia, and also he and Professor Peter Ward will co-investigator in a funded project involving the creation of a digital database of the approximately 96,000 Chinese Canadians who paid the discriminatory tax between 1885 and 1923. In 2012, Professor Yu also was a member of the committee that organized the granting of honorary degrees from UBC for the 76 Japanese Canadian UBC students who will be moved from the West Coast in 1942. Many of these students were unable to complete the studies or to attend their graduations. And the belated recognition as UBC alumni was part of a remarkable ceremony in May 2012 on the 70th anniversary of their removal from their school and home. I think this is remarkable that such a event can happen. So please help me welcome Professor Henry Yu.
Thank you for inviting me, and we're also coming out on a long weekend when it's sunny outside. So actually, just as a quick, get a sense, since we have 90 minutes or so, and since I just wanted to get a sense of everybody who is here and sort of what brought you today, like what were you interested in? So just a few short words, maybe starting in the back. We'll start you. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah. Just introduce yourself and sort of what led you to come.
Oh, cool. I'm Natalie. Well, my parents are part of the organization, so I'm kind of influenced by a lot of political science as well, and I'm pretty motivated by what's happening in Hong Kong right now, especially the student activist movement. So this is kind of what brought me here for to kind of know more about the entire history of this event.
Thank you.
One thing I want to add to this, Natalie designed the poster we put outside.
The tanks.
Yeah.
Wonderful, beautiful. Yeah. Well, beautiful and yet also nicely done. So, thank you.
Okay. My name is Martin. She's my sister.
Yeah.
So same thing. I just came here to pretty much to listen, learn, and it's not much.
Thanks. Anyone else? Just going through other people. Introduce yourself, maybe say your name, and then. Yeah, anyone, yeah.
I'm Arthur, and I came here on the interest of the history and background on the June 4th movement up till and the interest on recent events occurring in Hong Kong that are, well, not as directly related to this.
Okay.
My name is Yingwan. I'm interested in the memory of 65 war because 25 years ago, I was part of it. I was not in in Beijing, but in another city. The 6.4 is the least formatting thing for me. So that's why I'm here. And 2 weeks ago, I brought my son here. Like my son, 25 years ago, when I was only 2. At that time, I was a part of the movement. But now my son is 26 already. I want him to know something about this.
Thank you.
My name is William Lau. My major concern is the current situation in China and also China's future, including Hong Kong. And that's it.
My name is Meg. Just want to see what's the latest in terms of overseas Chinese, the role to play anywhere in Hong Kong or China. As we know, Dr. Xing Yinsen was coming to other part of the world, right, to get some support. So I just want to get an update on what's going on. I'd like to listen to all sides of the story. I like the one that is a witness to that, the government version and the other government's role. Or they important to them like Canadian government and things. So anyway, just want to get the facts, if we can get it.
Thank you. Thanks.
Not the truth, the facts.
Thank you. Other, yes, please.
Howard, and I just come from mainland of China. And actually, I just want to find out, because everybody know China is facing a serious problem in the recent future years. We want to find out approaching to make China be a better China, democratic, modern China. But we know the way to this object is going to be very dangerous in the next few years. Maybe will bring Chinese people a lot of something happened like 100 years ago. So how can we find a better way to avoid all this kind of damage, killing, and then we can reach our destination in a peaceful way? I think it's going to be a big challenge to all Chinese people.
Thank you.
My name is Wallace Chen, and I guess I'm really concerned about the development of China. I think for the past 20, 30 years, there have been a lot of economic development, but in terms of the political development, is probably not very satisfying. I guess it comes to a point, seems that China is getting to a bottleneck, so I think it's very critical, and we'd love to learn more about where China should be heading towards.
Thank you. Any others?
My name is Jian from Shanghai. So probably, according to my age, I have seen so many tragedies, hideous crimes committed by CCP, under Mao especially, and under Zhou, and under Teng, probably, possibly under like. So I come to see that first I'm an avid reader of 3 Hong Kong magazines, 开放、真名、动向. So the facts, they are basically trustworthy. I believe most people might agree. And I'm concerned to see human conscience within Vancouver, within Canada, and within this world, day by day, is more powerful and rising or down. These days, the development in the Ukraine, East Europe, and China are not very encouraging, and so we are concerned. We need to look back the last 30 years since Russia has a good man, Gorbachev, China has a good man, Hu Yaobao, and people react that we already defeat. We already have defeated communism, not so. That's my concern.
Any others? I don't want to force you to say anything, so you can just stay anonymous if you'd like. Well, let me, thank you. Oh, okay.
Maybe I add something.
Yeah.
What I've come to here is to learn more, probably some insight from Professor Yu. But interestingly, China wants to have a space program now, going to the moon. And also, I just met an engineer from Boeing. China wants to build an airplane, commercial, all those. Interestingly, I went to China, watching TV in a hotel, and local hotel this time. Previously, I went to tourist hotel. I can watch CNN, I can watch all those English channels. But last time when I was in China, probably 2 years ago, local hotel, they broadcast news from Hong Kong. And then one news covered the demonstration on Hong Kong street. So 5 seconds, it switched to a tree, a scenery. So my thinking is, how, when China is changing now, what are the leaders are thinking, and the bureaucrat, the whole system are thinking to rule people, and showing news or not showing news, and showing news to foreigner, but limited not to their only foreigner. So I want to know what they're thinking and how China going to that direction in the next 5 years or 10 years.
Thank you, Any others? Because I think it's very interesting to me and maybe to each other to just hear who else is here today. But, yeah, please.
Well, what I heard is probably quite deviated from the topic of your talk today.
That's okay. I can. No.
Democracy and overseas Chinese.
Yeah.
So I'm I'm involved in all this. So I've been to every lecture.
Yeah.
So I'm more interested in hearing about your perspective on democracy and overseas Chinese.
Actually, you're here to. Well, it's a pretty broad topic. I mean, democracy, just to use that word, I mean, if we were in a political science class, if we were UBC, we would probably spend the whole semester just defining all the different ways that people understood that, understand it now, what mechanisms and things like that. So that it is a very broad word. Then overseas Chinese itself, a very, loaded word because it's translated roughly from, Cantonese and Hokkien terms for those who are, but they wouldn't use, it's not an exact corollary. So let me just maybe lay out a couple of things I wanted to talk about. And actually, now that I've heard what some of you are interested in, what I mean by the topic is that there's 3 things I'll just talk about today, roughly. One is a long history of overseas migrants, and just by that I mean people who left mostly southern China, Guangdong province and Fujian province, so just that southern coast, for basically 500 years, and went what originally was into what we now call Southeast Asia, so places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, but that was overseas. For them, they were crossing the water, crossing the seas, and then eventually became Australia, North America, and then all over the world. So to just talk about that a little bit, and the importance of that history for the rise of Chinese nationalism, which somebody mentioned, Sun Dong-san, that rise of nationalism, but also of democracy, because that nationalism originally was tied to the idea that this would be a democratic nation, modeled upon things like the United States and others. So that I was just going to talk about first, because I'm a historian, so that's one of the things that I think is interesting to me. But the reason why I wanted to talk about that is to talk about number 2, and I'm glad some of you are interested in what's going on in Hong Kong now, because the second is the important role of Hong Kong and those areas in the south, Hong Kong, but also other ports, themselves as being the place which incubated a lot of the reform movements, revolutionary movements, national movements, democratic movements, other places like Singapore as well. So the importance of those places, and what one of my scholarly colleagues coined the term long-distance nationalism. So using, the idea like a telephone. Now we have, these things, and we do Skype and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't seem long distance anymore. But before, a long-distance phone call used to cost you a lot of money, right? And so long-distance nationalism, and what that might mean, and the important role of places like Hong Kong. And also now, where Hong Kong is, as it politically reverts to the control, or has reverted to the control of China, and what that might mean, actually, for what has been about a 150-year-long history of Hong Kong being one of the important places for, democracy, nationalist movements, all of these kinds of things within Greater China. So that's the second I'll talk about. And the third and last is actually thinking about that then. How do we think about now the very large numbers of Chinese who aren't Cantonese and Fujianese, but are coming from all parts of China, who go overseas for tourism, to go to school, for business. So what you're getting now is there are more, actually, Chinese going out around the world than there ever has been before, in terms of just raw numbers. So if you think about the number of people until around the year 2000 who were descended from, or directly themselves migrated from China, the estimates were probably about 100 million people around the world were descended from Chinese, somewhere around the world. Now if you think about the last, say, 10, 15 years of just tourism alone, and how many Chinese have left China, maybe just for a few days, or to go to places like Hong Kong and everywhere around the world, the numbers are in basically the tens of millions a year. And if you think of all those people going out and seeing the world, maybe all they're seeing is handbags, stores, and maybe they're not seeing anything except a shopping mall. But others maybe are seeing more. And that's really, in some sense, what I wanted to end on, was to think about 150 years of the importance of the overseas Chinese, to use that term in English, in creating a sense of a new China, and then playing a role in it. Is there a role for the new overseas Chinese, you might say, the Chinese who are some of who are in this room, who left China in the last 20 years, let's say, and who are now in places like Canada, Australia, but everywhere in the world, Austria, Germany. You can't go anywhere in the world now and not find ethnic Chinese. You can go to Norway past the Arctic Circle and you'll still find a Chinese restaurant. So there's nowhere in the world you can't escape. You can escape Chinese food, right? Anywhere you go. So that's one way of thinking about it. So let's go first to the first part, just about the history. Now, most of you, I think, probably know that history, but I'll just go over it quickly for, just so that we're all sort of on the same page. And that is that, again, when you think about the fall of the Qing Empire in 1910, 1911, and it was one of the longest lasting empires in Chinese dynastic history. It's incredibly strong, actually, in terms of imperial rule. Even at the early 19th century, so in the early 1800s, there's no thought that this empire would fall, because it had a strong control of vast amounts of territory, one of the largest land-held empires. Its economy was the largest in the world in 1800. Just the internal economy of internal trade in China. It was sucking in silver from the Spanish Empire. So the Acapulco-Manila trade was basically Spanish, and Portuguese as well, but mostly Spanish, taking gold and silver from people in the Americas, putting them on huge galleons, some going straight to Spain, but a lot of it would then go to the Philippines, where they would trade for Chinese goods, and the silver just kept on coming in. The British would go to Southeast Asia. Again, we know this story in rough because but the thing I point out is that the Qing is incredibly strong politically, economically, in terms of imperial control. So one of the things I think which is really interesting about that story is the role that already was being played by the 1600s in terms of Chinese merchants. Now, we use this term Chinese very loosely. And I think it's important to understand that most of those merchants who were in places like Malacca, Jakarta, these places we still know today, Saigon or Solon in Vietnam, they were from two very small coastal areas around Guangdong, or on the south coast of Guangdong and the south coast of Fujian. Right? They spoke a range of dialects, but basically around Minnan or Hokkien dialects and Cantonese dialects, or also Hakka and others. But it's a very small area. It's a fraction of the rest of China. And for most of that 500 years, they were not part of the imperial state. So they're very loosely connected, or they were considered pirates. So under the Ming at the end, there was a ban. Many of you who know your Chinese history know that the Ming banned trade. The Qing did not mind for a long time, but then by the, again, end of the empire, there are strictures on overseas trade. So a lot of this trade was, in the view of the imperial state, illegal. But it didn't stop it. In fact, this was one of the long-term facts of global history, is that people who thought of themselves as, and again, we use the term in English Chinese, but if you think about just those who are Cantonese speakers, you know that the term for much of the history of the Cantonese version of Chinese history was Tong Yan, people of the Tang dynasty. Not the term, again, that you vast majority of Chinese now use, people of the Han, but people of the Tang dynasty. And their sense was that it was really the truest attainment of Chinese civilization was Tang poetry, Tang dynasty, and that it was the southern Tang dynasty that were the true inheritors of Chinese civilization, and that they were never overcome by barbarians. And this gets taught to children, it's like, really, the Cantonese or also Hokkien speakers have the same view, that they are the inheritors of Chinese civilization, that the foreign barbarians are from the north. Right? The two foreign dynasties, the Mongols, and so again, this is part of the mythic China. But one of the things I think is important to understand is that in material ways, that merchant set of networks that were around Cantonese and Hokkien speakers, that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they were at the center of a kind of Southeast Asian commercial empire. Not a political empire, commercial. The politics of that commercial empire were generally left to either existing kingdoms, or as European colonialism expanded into Southeast Asia, the politics of those empires eventually became the colonies of the Dutch, the British, the French. But the commercial empires remained. And those were long-term, persistent. They were tied to ports on the coast of Fujian and on Guangdong, so Macau was a major port. The trade that went through Guangzhou and the Canton trade was major, but really with the British and a few. So we know lots about that if you're Canadian or if you're American, because Canton was where a lot of the trade to the United States and Great Britain went. But actually for the Portuguese Empire and for the Dutch and others, there were plenty of other ports up and down. So I give all this because what that created by the 1900s, but really by the late 1800s, was vibrant anti-Qing societies. Again, we know those ones that were geared towards the overthrow of the Qing Empire. They've been long-standing for hundreds of years, but they began to become more and more actually powerful because of their ability to operate in European imperial spaces. Because Europe controlled so many of politically the spaces now of their colonies in Southeast Asia, the Chinese who were there were somewhat protected in an ironic way. So that's actually where the nationalist movements and the anti-Qing government movements really began. The scholar Benedict Anderson wrote a very important book. It's almost 40 years old now. It was called Imagined Communities. And his argument was that modern nationalism did not arise in Europe. It wasn't about kings being replaced by countries. So one of the very common stories is that France and all these places were kingdoms. There was a king of France, and then they became nations, with parliaments and da. So nation building was a European invention. Benedict Anderson's argument was, no, that's wrong, actually. Nationalism, he said, was the product of empire. And it was generally the product of colonies. Now, Benedict Anderson was an expert, actually, on what we would call Indonesia, now, the history of the Dutch East Indies. And what he noticed was the importance of people who aren't in the place that is imagined as the nation for creating an idea of that. And so one of the examples is Irish nationalism, the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Lots of its support came from Irish Americans in the United States and people like that. Italy, during the imagining of an Italian nation, came often from Italian. In fact, even the idea that they were Italian rather than from Naples or Sicily or from some small part was imagined as they went overseas into places like the United States and Argentina. You could say the same for Chinese nationalism. It was the people who were overseas who imagined a single new nation called China. So the new nationalism of people like Sun Yat-sen or Sun Yat-sen, it came from people who were from overseas families, who themselves had gone overseas. So he went to school in Japan. But he was from a family that for hundreds of years had been going out from Zhongshan through Macau into places like Southeast Asia, Malacca, to places eventually like Australia. This is important because if we forget that and we think that Chinese nationalism and nation building was internal to China, then we actually give too much credit to certain movements like the rise of the Communist Party in Shanghai, or even the kind of way in which the KMT party eventually came to rule places like Taiwan. In fact, a lot of the original people who were nationalists were either overseas, or went overseas and came back, or lived in places like Hong Kong and Singapore. Hong Kong was crucial, and I'll sort of shift this slightly, because it was a colonial space after 1848, 1849. And it became a place where if you were Cantonese or other ethnic Chinese from the overseas empire, the overseas commercial empire, you could say, that was not tied to the Chinese state, you could be in places like Hong Kong, and you could be protected again from the Qing imperial state. And so overseas Chinese nationalism is an overseas product. I'll tell you some ways in which that's actually important to understand too, is that when you leave a place, and you see it in recent, people from China, they still come from China, and you can say, but then the association you'll go to every week is the Sichuan Association, right? And all the people from the same area, and you're Sichuan. Well, 150 years ago, where you came from was everything, because dialects were so different from each other. So when Sun Yat-sen came through Vancouver, he gave a speech. Nobody could understand him. And the reason why is Sun Yat-sen never learned Mandarin, and he never learned anything except his home dialect, Zhongshan dialect. He's speaking to people who were 2/3, so basically Toisan, plus another a quarter of the total population were Siyapti. So the vast majority, except from less than 7%, spoke dialects that were mutually unintelligible. So when he gave a speech, he couldn't raise any money because no one understood what he was saying. Okay? Now, he was able to raise money because a lot of the fellow nationalists and fellow reformers were actually Toisan speakers, and they could also write and read it out, because again, the vast majority of the people here were illiterate. So the speeches were very important. If you couldn't convince people during a speech, they weren't going to follow you. So someone else had to speak in the right dialect for the audience to understand Sun Yat-sen. Now, that may seem funny, like the father of Chinese nationalism spoke only his home dialect and no one else could understand him. He was still successful, but it was because the networks were based around these dialects. And when he came to Vancouver or in Victoria, well, those people in the other overseas associations and overseas networks, they could translate for him. And they also supported him and believed in what he was saying. In fact, there was a Cantonese speaking, a set of different Cantonese dialects that were at the center of overseas Chinese nationalism in the late 19th, all the way through the first half of the 20th century. Why is this important to understand? One is that most of those people, they would have identified with the village they came from, the county they came from, the dialect they spoke, and at some abstract level, they would have said they were Chinese, and they would have used a term like Tongyan. Right? So Chinatown, we still use that term in Cantonese. Tongyan Gai is Chinatown, the sort of the street or the quarter or the area where people who are Chinese. But Chinese is a very particular form of that. It's people like us. And the us, at that time, was first and foremost people who spoke the same dialect and came from the same places. And then a bit beyond that, sort of Cantonese speakers. But eventually what they could imagine is a new China not based around empire and dynasties, the long unbroken past of dynasty after dynasty, but they could imagine actually a new nation based on people coming together overseas. And so one of the things that happened overseas was the local associations, family associations, everything, they actually would get together and create things like the CBA, the Consolidated Benevolent Association. In San Francisco was the first one, but there was others very similar in places like Singapore and Hong Kong. But in other words, you could come together beyond just your local origins to imagine something bigger. That's when Benedict Anderson imagined community. How could you imagine to be part of something bigger? That new China was a new imaginary. It didn't work very well. That's why you could say the 1911 revolution failed, is because that sense of the new nation, very few people, as the Qing Empire fell, they didn't understand it, because they actually had never been outside China. So you lived still in the ways in which you had for a long time. The places in southern China, in Guangdong and Fujian province, they understood because they were tied for hundreds of years to overseas Chinese. They could imagine this new nation. They could imagine also how things could be different because they had lived in places that were different. If you had lived in the United States, lived in Canada, lived in the Australian colonies, lived in Southeast Asia, if you'd lived in other places, you could actually see things that were different and then imagine what it would be like if China had this or that, things like voting, things like, so it wasn't an abstract concept, things like democracy. They could actually see it in operation elsewhere. Now they may not agree with everything they saw, and they'd say, oh, let's take this one and bring it back. But they actually had lived in other places. Hong Kong at that time was not a sterling example of democracy. In fact, there was nothing democratic about Hong Kong. It was a colonial port that was controlled by a small number of British administrators with the government backing of the military. They had Punjabi Sikh soldiers and policemen from other parts of the empire. But it also had the rule of law. In other words, contracts would be honored. There were bureaucratic systems in place to collect whatever needed to be collected, implement rules. So one of the interesting things about the long-term Hong Kong colonial history is that people who went to Hong Kong, went through Hong Kong, did business in Hong Kong, have a really strong sense of the importance of good laws, because they've experienced when business deals go sour, the importance of good contract law, dispute mechanisms for arguing over. They're not big in terms of experience of voting, because that actually was a very recent invention, you could say, in Hong Kong. But the rule of law was crucial, and the rule of good bureaucracies was crucial. So I think for a lot of Hong Kong Chinese, if you ask them what was the most important thing about Hong Kong that, you know, that you think about as being the gift of the British, so to speak, is legal mechanisms and bureaucracy. The cleaning of the Hong Kong bureaucracy in the 1960s, you know, making sure the civil servants were not corrupt. That was an incredibly important development. And again, is associated with good government and associated with democracy, even though democracy, most people think about it around the world as you get to vote. In fact, a lot of the characteristics that overseas Chinese picked up in places all around the world were things that were not just about the voting, but characteristics of other societies that were democratic societies that had other kinds of institutions. Rule of law, judicial review, so the ability to go to court, right? The implementation of laws all the time that were consistent. It's not a small thing. If you just change laws and you change what they're for, you know, people don't believe in the laws anymore. You have to have consistency in how laws are used and how they're enforced and all these kinds. These are all things that, again, that we think of as democratic, but they're actually not tied formally to what, again, most people think of as democracy, is just voting. In fact, voting every 4 years, as we can see in lots of the experiments over the last 3 or 4 years, the Arab Spring, if it's just about voting, it very quickly falls apart. Because if only you have a vote and then for the next 4 years the majority government can do whatever they want, very quickly you have chaos. And so one of the things I think, just to sort of end that and move into the last couple, is that the overseas Chinese were crucial. On the one hand, they were safe to organize outside of the imperial state of China, of China. So they could actually do things like organize societies, organize, you know, nationalist movements, revolutionary movements. So that's one. They also had money and backing because they were generally commercial networks. So Chinese nationalism, you could say, overseas nationalism, was a merchant phenomenon. Where did the money for nationalism come from? Outside China. The third was that they got ideas while they were outside and everywhere around about what worked in other places, and then they imagined bringing those ideas back to China. One of the most important places for that was Hong Kong. Another was Singapore. You can think about these as two of the places where the fountains of the ideas of a new China came out of. They were major cities. They were under British colonial rule, so they were politically, you could say, safe, relatively safe. You could raise a lot of money because they were both commercial hubs. They were dense, you know, sort of networks there. So that's why the importance of overseas Chinese for democracy. So that's, for those who are interested in what the history of democracy in overseas Chinese, that's the history. So, you know, I'll shift and go to the part about what now. One is, since '97, what you've seen, and many of you know this firsthand, is a very slow erosion of what Hong Kong was. It took a while for people to notice, I think, because at first the Chinese sort of Communist Party left it alone. So slowly let them, you know, change. So the two, I think you could say, if you were to group the two things just in the context of what we're talking about today, the two things I'd say that, you know, are very important as trends is, one, the economy of Hong Kong is no longer an entrepot economy geared at moving goods in and out of what was a very closed China. For the first actually a few years after the handover, it still was doing that because so many factories were on the other side, so many goods were still coming through. Hong Kong was still an entrepot, as it had been for basically the 60 years since the Communist Revolution. Hong Kong was not a very big port. 1949 changed that, when the other ports that went in and out of goods and people could go in and out of China, when they were closed off, Hong Kong became more important. And so really it became the modern Hong Kong we think of in the 1950s, playing a role of things going in and out. After 97, that started to very quickly die off. And we're at a point now where it's still a port, but it's nowhere near as important as it was even 30 years ago. So that's one economy. The other is it's become the shopping mall of China. Right? That even though most of the goods in Hong Kong are made in China, they're only trusted in Hong Kong. In other words, the branding was only trusted. And so you have basically tens of thousands of people a day coming to shop in Hong Kong. And so that's part of the resentment of those who are Hong Kong Chinese. So what does this mean for democracy? And one is why we're all gathered, is because the last great hope, you could say, of democracy as a movement within Hong Kong as an overseas space, that's what is under threat. And that's what, in some sense, the protesting each year, and the fear of what will happen long term. Why actually it is an important fear. It's not just people being chauvinistic about Hong Kong. That if Hong Kong is lost, then what historically, for the last really 150 years, has been the main place for the nurturing of imaginings of a better China is going to be gone. And that's what's slowly being strangled off. And that's why Hong Kong actually is important, because if we think about it in terms of the overseas Chinese and that long history, Hong Kong's been the vital center for that throughout those 150 years. So its slow loss is actually an incredibly large threat to what's going to happen in the future. Let me say a couple other things about that. For instance, why can't it be Singapore instead? Why won't Singapore be the center of the democratic movement overseas? Part of that is because Singapore is far. Right? It's what made it safe before. But if you actually look at the history of the political parties that arose in Singapore versus Hong Kong, right? Always those that were the most revolutionary were tied with Hong Kong. Singapore, in fact, was never the same kind of incubator of radical ideas, of the forms of nationalism, which eventually did play a prominent role in the fall of the Qing and things like that. So it's not that it wasn't important, it was, but it just very quickly you could say it was very far, that the merchants there and the kind of political elite there and the merchant elite were less interested in the politics of China. And you could say that's never changed very much, that's actually been a long-term trend too, that even today in Singapore, there is less of an idea that that's the place where you would go think about a new China and go to school and go to the universities and things like that, whereas Hong Kong has always been much more tied to those kinds of movements. So Hong Kong, again, is a crucial place. But I think the other one is it's been a very Cantonese phenomenon. Overseas
What about Taiwan?
So that's a very good question. So what is Taiwan in relation to Chinese nationalism and overseas democracy movements? The history of Taiwan is I wasn't going to talk about it, but if you're interested, is different because it began 500 years ago as a place where people, especially from Hokkien speakers from Fujian, went and created trade networks. It was one of the main, but not the main. In fact, it was a minor area within a larger Hokkien trade network. They were going to all around Southeast Asia, places eventually like Singapore, but they were in Manila, they were in the Philippines, they were in what we now call Vietnam and Cambodia. Indochina was a major area for Hokkien trade. They were in what we call Indonesia, but the Indies. So everywhere where you have the Hokkien trade networks, they're still there. Taiwan was one of them, but it was a minor area. And I mean minor in the sense that it wasn't a major trade hub. You know, we know the major trade hubs, Jakarta, Manila, you know, their names we still know. Taiwan is relatively minor. Now what happened is, though, that when it became, went from the Dutch to the Japanese, you know, and became part of the Japanese Empire in 1905, it developed very quickly as a colonial area, plantations, and when it was taken over after the Civil War, as the KMT came over, that's when you get the rise of what you might call long-term nationalism. It's very interesting when you examine under the Japanese colonial rule, the amount of what you might call nationalist politics was actually very little. The idea that Taiwan should be an independent nation based around the Taiwanese, or the Hokkien speakers, or the Minnan, or the Taiwanese speakers, is something that really is a product of the last 60, 70 years. It's KMT rule, and kind of, it's not even colonialism, it's what it is the imagining of this as the sort of heart of the China that should be, instead of the China that became communist. That's actually been the major impetus for Taiwanese nationalism. So the rise of this idea that there, and again, just to prove the point that nationalism is often overseas, the two main places where Taiwanese nationalism was imagined was here and in San Francisco, and also Los Angeles. So you had a lot of Taiwanese nationalist intellectuals. In other words, school students overseas in North America who had escaped, you could say, KMT rule, but knew what was going on in the 1950s and 60s. They knew, so they still wrote about and thought about the massacres that occurred when the KMT first came into Taiwan. The memory, in other words, of a Taiwan, and it's not even an independent Taiwan, because Taiwan had been under Japanese colonial rule. They had to actually imagine a Taiwan that had never existed before, a Taiwan that wasn't part of colonial Dutch rule or colonial Japanese rule or KMT rule. So they had to imagine what it might be to have a nation built around, and this is where language is crucial, a language that was being squashed. Because the KMT were implementing, basically the national language, again, what we call in English Mandarin, then the elimination of what was now known as Taiwanese became a political issue. It was never a political issue because the Japanese only trained the elite Japanese. They had Japanese language training in schools, but they didn't attempt to eliminate Hokkien. The KMT attempted to eliminate Hokkien as part of its implementation of Mandarin as a national language. And so what happens is Taiwanese speaking your national tongue becomes the center of the politics of Taiwanese nationalism by the 1980s and 90s. So Taiwanese nationalism is a response to KMT rule. It's an imagining of a nationalism that's not for China, but for only Taiwan. So it's not like Taiwanese nationalism is about imagining a new China. In fact, that's why Taiwanese nationalists will refuse to be identified as Chinese. In the United States, they refuse to tick off the box of being Chinese, ethnic Chinese, in the census. And the reason why is to be Taiwanese means not to be Chinese. It's to be in a 500-year history of having left China and never being a part of it, of being ruled successively by other colonial powers, European as well as Japanese, and as well as Chinese occupiers. So for them, the KMT in China is one in a long line of occupation, colonial occupiers. And Taiwanese, the language, and Taiwanese, the people, are not Chinese. So that's the difference with Hong Kong, is that it's not an overseas nationalism. It is in the same way. It is an overseas nationalism. You think of the students who were the Taiwanese students in North America who imagined an independent Taiwan, one that wasn't being ruled, one that didn't speak Mandarin. So the Green Party, the Taiwanese Nationalist Party, you could say, is really a product of overseas nationalism, just as the KMT was when it was imagined by Sun Yat-sen and his followers. Does that answer? Sorry, so hopefully that also helps actually understand some of the other things I was saying when you see how different Taiwanese nationalism is as an overseas phenomenon, and that they're not a Chinese nationalist movement. They are about Taiwan. So just as a final kind of thing, now I'd love to give more questions and discussion, is what about the role of, if you think about this history of democracy and the overseas Chinese, or nationalism and the overseas Chinese, and you could also say reimagining China when you're not in China. And that maybe is the way I would put it very clearly. It's one thing to be in China and to imagine how things might change. If you're a reformer, as an official, if you are someone who is a party member, or someone who's anti-party, or a local organizer, it's one thing to imagine change within it. It's another to imagine change from without, from outside. And I think that's one thing I would just throw as an important way to think about, what is going on right now, is that for much of the 20th century, the vast majority of Chinese could not leave. They were contained within the continental China. Only a very few people associated, again, with areas that had been sending people overseas for centuries could go around the rest of the world. That's why, from up until the year 2000, the vast majority of all Chinese outside of China, their native tongue was either Cantonese, Hokkien, or one of the other dialects in southern China. That's it. 99.9% of people who were Chinese Canadian before basically the year 2000 spoke Cantonese as a mother tongue. Australia, 99.9% of those in Australia who were Chinese Australian spoke Cantonese as a mother tongue. About 90% of the Chinese in the United States were Cantonese speaking, Siyao, Punsan, same things. The other 10% came through Taiwan. So they were either KMT, migrants, or they were native Taiwanese. But only 10%. That pattern is the one that's changed irrevocably. So the last 15 years, since the year 2000, what you have is the number of Cantonese going overseas has either remained stagnant or shrunk. It's everyone else. So all the new Chinese migrations are coming from other parts of China, sometimes also from Guangdong province, but mostly from other parts of China. And that's the overseas Chinese. So the very term overseas Chinese no longer refers, if you used that term before, right, what you generally meant were Cantonese or Hokkien speakers from the southern part of China. Now if you say overseas Chinese in English, I think it hasn't shifted in English, but if you think conceptually, who are we talking about for the last 15 years? What are the vast numbers of people who, and it's not just places like Vancouver, but any place outside of China, they're now from all parts of China. So how do we actually think about that both as, I use the term historically, it was 15 years, so that's not history yet. But if you want to predict the future, and maybe that's the way to get to many of your questions, where is China going? And what are the role of those who are outside China in the future of China? That is the biggest open question, and one of the most interesting questions. Because if you put it in the context of 500 years of overseas Chinese, of 150 years of Chinese nationalism and democracy, democratic movements and radical movements within China that were basically nurtured, fermented, I guess, that's not a bad word, but, really just raised in parts outside, thought about by people outside. So where does that leave us for now? So I'll just end with like 3 quick thoughts in that sense. One is that one of the things that is very parallel is the tension or relationship between local and regional identities and a national one. China, again, is an empire of regions that are very strong. Even though over the last 60 years you've had the implementation of a national language, it has not erased regional identities. In fact, those regional identities remain very strong. And you can see it, in fact, in some of the dialect movements as regional dialects start pushing back against, the national language. And so the importance in many regions, people saying we have to save our language because as we notice our children no longer speaking, Sichuan dialect or. When lots of people have money, they begin to think they deserve things, right? It's just, that we use that term entitlement, right? And wealth creates a sense of entitlement. Now, that could be expressed as corruption, as, I'm entitled to all these things. Law doesn't apply to me, rules don't apply to me, I get to kill people. So you have officials and wealthy people who do just horrible things because that sense of entitlement is so high. But one of the other ironic effects of entitlement is when you have lots and lots of people feel entitled, if they don't have a sense of control or say about how things are run, that creates political problems. And in some sense, it's one thing for poor people to protest. It's another for a large number of people with relative wealth to protest. Because then the people who feel like they don't have a say, they actually have wealth. One of the things about, so I'll put it back in the overseas Chinese movement, because of the relative shift in how overseas wealth, the value of that within China, that's the huge shift. And I said that in 1800, the year 1800, China was still very wealthy. Taxation was through silver. Silver was flowing in from overseas trade. It was actually an inflationary economy in China. Lots of wealth. In fact, the late Qing was one of the wealthiest periods in Chinese society ever. But that's what changed, is that by the mid-19th century, by 1840s, 1850s, the balance of trade had shifted, overpopulation had created effects. So within half a century, the Chinese internal economy was really under great amounts of pressure. And so if you left and made money in Australia or the United States and then sent money back, the value of that $1 being sent back by the late 19th century was huge. And so going back to the question of wealth, that was crucial because the overseas money that could be funneled back for reform was huge. One of the things I think is really interesting is to think about split families. In the 19th century, what you did is you went away as a young male, you made money, right? Lots of money, sent it back, and you kept your children and wife in China because $1 buys a lot more in China, right? So the balance, you could say, of the value of money, that was what it was in 19th century China. It said something about how poor China is. What would you do now if you were to split your family? You would work in China, and you would send your children and your wife overseas.
Yes.
Because the money you earn in China will go farther here, right? You'll get more for your education for your kids. Just think about that. That is actually the biggest shift, right? And that shift, if you think about it in terms of entitlement, in terms of, that's one explanation, you could say, for why the overseas Chinese were so crucial for political movements overseas, both in coming up with the ideas, as I mentioned, because you were outside, you could see things, but the other was because they had more money. Even a fruit grocer in Sydney, right, could open the first department store in Shanghai. So all 4 department stores in Shanghai, they think of you're from Shanghai, right? What are they? They're the Wing On, the Sincere, the big 4, right? Every single one was a Zhongsan overseas family. The Ma family, the Guok family, the Choi family. They were all made their money overseas and then sent it back to China. You can make it selling fruit in Sydney and pool it, and you have a department store, the first department stores in China. So that shift is crucial. So again, so what does that mean? Does that mean that the money inside is more important than the outside? Or does it mean that in fact, as we see people shift their wealth from China to places like Vancouver, that provides the possibility, again, that if they were to become politicized, that again, how does that money work? Would it be the same as before? I don't have the answers, but I do think money is important because you can't support political movements without money. It's
So
very
money
difficult.
and is the economical. So
Yeah.
is the under the war now. It's
Yeah.
the, like the American the money to the China money to the
Yeah.
like the PC, the government
Yeah.
want to do the business LNG want to
Yeah.
sell into the China mainland China market.
So that's where to make the money.
Yeah.
So, but one of the things again is people ask, will there ever be a middle class revolution in China? You could wait a long time for a middle class revolution in China. I don't know. I mean, because I
Yes,
think
exactly.
it's a big question. I don't pretend to be able to predict that one. But I can say that one of the things is as people show up overseas it is perhaps a challenge, but also it's an opportunity because if you send your kids overseas, remember they're students, and who are the most dangerous people in the world? Students. It's much harder to convince a middle-aged entrepreneur who made all his money and he believes he knows everything, right? Those were the hardest. It's like Singapore was wealthier than Hong Kong in many ways. Those merchants were harder to politicize. And so one of the things in Singapore that made it more politically conservative is you could say the Singapore oligarchy, the ones who ran the Singapore economy, were a number of big families who were very wealthy, and they were conservative politically. So if you're looking for the middle class revolution in China, I'd say the best place to start the middle class revolution in China is their kids overseas. Is as their kids are overseas taking classes away from their father, away from family, away from sometimes away from their mother too. That's where you actually politicize them.
That's why Christy Hart wanted to increase 4 times of foreign
I'm not sure she wants to do a revolution. She doesn't want to start a revolution. But, and that actually goes to the second thing I thought as you were speaking, was just education and the importance of education. To me, there's a reason why the fight in Hong Kong over education is so crucial. Because one of the strangest things I find is I don't teach Chinese history at UBC. I teach migration, I teach overseas Chinese history. But my colleagues who teach Chinese history, and I know you had Josephine Xu at Duke, and you had Dinah Larry before that, but increasingly, and I think it's only really the last 5-6 years I've seen, a student who's gone to school in the PRC all the way, they will take a Chinese history class at UBC because the version of Chinese history that they know has no relationship to reality.
Yes.
I think that's what you were saying too.
Only it's the revolution.
It's just a revolution.
People.
Everything's through the revolution.
Yeah.
But then their whole history of the dynasties is all very, because I would almost say there's one thing that's always very shocking to students when they take Chinese history here, is the possibility that there is no China. Because that's one of the things you get taught, I think, in China, is as dynasties fall, right, the worst parts were the chaos, the warring states, the king, because there is no China. And that's chaos. And so, very much as in Singapore, what you try to ground into all children is the fear of chaos, the fear of there not being a single China, and China breaks up. you know, okay, the Chinese Empire's been around for a long time, but that's, you know, doesn't need to be the single lesson is that all of dynastic history is about, you know, good rule and then there's chaos, you know, good rule and then chaos, good rule and chaos. And so, you know, the fear, that's just one example, but I think one of the things is the education system, you know, if you're, you know, history is politics, and that's always been the case in China, and so the history you teach, and I think that is one of the real issues in Hong Kong, is that is an important element of what people grow up to believe what is possible and not possible. And again, that's why to me, if you can take all these overseas students and you can teach them about the possibilities, you know, they're more dangerous than all the people with money on the inside because they have access to wealth too. A lot of the overseas students right now, they do come from families where there is, and they're not all rich, but they have enough wealth to be able to send their children overseas. And that's not a small thing. That's more of a middle-class revolution from the outside. And so again, if you're plotting the revolution, I would plot it on the outside, not on the inside.
I have a comment about these Chinese students coming up from China, studying, and then, well, you know, in the last 10, 15 years, many of them have gone back. And of course, there's still many younger students here. You don't see they do anything politically that would put China in a progressive mode. So I don't see any optimism depending on these students to, well, start revolution.
Yeah, I don't think it's happening right now, and whether again, it's not one of my personal missions to start the revolution through my students. And I'm not, this is one thing. But, partly I think because that would be, just personally for me, I'm not the right person. I think I can't convince someone. The amount of connection I have to someone who's grown up in China is actually relatively small. As I said, I grew up here and went to school over here and all those kinds of stuff. I don't speak with them in their language. Literally, not just Mandarin. I mean, they're 19-year-olds who grew up in China, and some of them I don't even understand. Some of them, because one of the things I often do with my students is I ask them to do an oral history of their parents or their family and show me. And so I watch some of the things that the Chinese students do, and I have no connection. I hear about their parents and I hear about their family and the way they grew up, and they might as well have been on Mars, and not because I don't want to understand. It's just it's a very different background, and so I think it would be hard for me to convince them because I probably look like I'm from Mars. So if I start telling them, "Oh, you should do this, you should do that," they're not going to listen to me. What I can do is I can talk about things like today and say, "Here's the long-term history of democratic movements outside of China, nationalist movements outside of China." Again, to put June 4th into its context, which is that June 4th was a very strange moment in the radical revolution within China, because it's very hard to say, you were there. It was a special moment, you could say, and I actually went through, I think I said this last year, I went through China about 3 months later, after June, so it was around September, and it was a very, it was clean. I went through, the square. It was cleaned. It was as if it never happened, and a very, it's a very odd, and I think in some sense that's what you learn in China right now if you're growing up. Yes. It's as if it didn't happen, right? Unless you were there, it's as if it didn't happen, and people still, I think, in some sense, don't understand it in a way that makes sense. So maybe that's why I really would have someone else can, though. I mean, as I said, they're here. I think you're right that a lot of them, they want to learn how to make money and go back and make money, or they want to learn how to implement laws. But I'll give one example just for optimism. St. John's College, we, because of our tie to the original St. John's University, China, which just for those who don't know the story of St. John's University in Shanghai, it was closed in 1952. It was everything the communists hated. It was an American missionary university created in 1879. So American, missionaries, so it's Christians, bad. Right? Most of the most powerful people in Shanghai went to St. John's. All the landed, gentry, all the capitalists, all of the so wealthy Shanghaiese capitalists, third bad thing. Fourth, you could say, was it these were actually, really, they were students, right? But not only, so it's very interesting. Some of them actually became party intellectuals. I did an oral history with one of the people who were founded UBC's St. John's College, because they closed in 1952. They basically said never going to be reopened again. But one of the people I was doing an interview, he came from a very wealthy landowning family, and so he did economics, MBA, ended up he left, went to Hong Kong. His family opened the textile industry, one of the textile factories, was basically at the top of Hong Kong society for most of it. So very well, very kind, gentle man, but everything that you'd say the communists hated. His younger sister, he said, in 1950, 49-50, his younger sister disappeared. So his family just assumed she was killed. Must be because, she's St. John's University, right? 3 years later, she pops up again. She actually was an underground communist the whole time. She was at St. John's University. In fact, there was cells, communist cells at St. John's University, right? His sister was one of them, and she ended up being actually a literature professor at the Beijing University for the rest of her life. So it's interesting. It's often the sort of, we joke in the United States and Canada about Mercedes Marxists, right? All the radicals who drive around in expensive cars. But often, those students who understand the problems the most are those who come from those families. Because the thing about his sister was, she saw the corruption from within. She saw all the evil, and that's why she became a communist. So in that sense, if I was a better, organizer, if I was really a revolutionary rather than just a professor, I think, being able to kind of talk about in a first-hand way that resonates with the students. What is your family like in China? When you look around, you see the corruption, and you see just a terrible, horrific, hideous, to use your term, things that go on. And yet here you are, you have the privilege of being able to do things that would make it different. And you have, in some sense, the power and maybe even a sense of entitlement that the world should be better for someone like you. If you don't feel powerless when you're entitled, that's the whole idea of entitlement. I feel like I deserve better. And people who think they deserve better often are crucial for actually making things different. So all this is to say that I said, even if I myself am not sure how to shift these students, I'd say just step up and say from a historical point of view, if it's not going to be from them, I'm not sure who it would be from, actually. Because the students here are different than those who are at Veda. Because if you are at Veda, you are already some part of the system, and there's very little for you to gain, in this, because these are students. At that time, they felt they were powerless, and that this was the main way that they could change the world, so that they could have hope. I'm not sure if you went to Beijing University now, the students feel powerless. They feel probably that there are these ways in which they are going to be in control. I meet many of the people who come from we have students who are from the political science departments at Beijing University, and what they're trying to learn is how to implement better legal systems. The last one I'll tell you is St. John's College. We had a student from about 10 years ago. She came to do law here, and so she's just been appointed last year onto the judicial, I actually can't remember the exact name of it's called, but it's sort of a judicial review. So she's a judge now. And she and a group of her fellow performers are part of the group that's responsible for the fall in the number of executions each year. That's what she came here to actually learn 10 years ago, was not human rights, it's just what she learned about was law. And, you know, so is she one of the, you know, what is she? Is she going to change China? Well, she has. She's already, her and another group, you know, her and her cadre, you could say, of judges and lawyers have been quietly cutting the number of, you know, judicial executions down. You know, anything that she's had to say over has been. So I don't know, I mean, that's a quiet reform. It's not revolution, it's not democracy, but when we think about what's crucial for the rule of law, law that's not arbitrary is perhaps more as important as a vote.
Mm-hmm.
So,